For John, this was a major decision and was filled with excitement about the idea. He spent his days listening to various recordings of the Messiah. Max came home from work one day to find him standing in the center of the lounge with headphones on, conducting the music as if he was standing in front of a major orchestra. He was in a world of his own, and Max was starting to understand why this was so important to him. Music was his soul and at the center of his life. John had his eyes closed, and he was closed and lost in the music without realizing that anyone else was there in the room. It was a sharp contrast to the John who he had originally met. He was a man who loved his opera and classical music. The choir was so important to him, especially after the success of the concert at the Royal Opera House. For Kurt, he was used to this. In the same way he loved playing his computer games, John loved his music. They were very different people in this respect, but still there was a great deal of love between the two men. Kurt was happy to help John with his choir whenever he was asked. When not, he was happy for John to go his own way, knowing that as soon as any problems arose, he would be there asking for help. Max was realizing this special relationship that John and Kurt had. It was not obvious to anyone who didn't really know them. When they were out together, they never appeared to be a couple. People could see that they were friends, but their personalities were so different that they appeared to be friends only. Love, though, was there from both sides, and the security of their relationship was clear to see. For Max, he didn't really understand this. He expected them to be more affectionate with each other, but they weren't like that. The bond was so strong between them that they didn't need to show any outward affection. There was no outward jealousy from each. There was just nothing. There were no arguments between the two of them. They just accepted each other as they were, and the two of them fitted together without any seams. Max came to realize that when it came to John and Kurt's relationships, opposites really do attract. There was still the question of the venue for the Easter concert. Max and John spent one weekend touring around the different places that would or could hold a concert for the choir. Each one of them was very welcoming after hearing about the concert at the Opera House. John had a choice to make. Some of the venues were suitable, but John wanted to find a place that would not only be different from the theatre, but it would be suitable for the performance of Handel's Messiah. It was his choice of the music that was now driving him. He had even drawn up a list of professional opera singers that he wanted to invite to sing the main sections. He was hoping also that he could find someone who was not only suitable, but were also not going to charge him a fortune for their services. Finally, after visiting about 4 or 5 major venues in the centre of Brussels, John made his decision. It was to be the church Église Notre-Dame du Sablon, in the centre of Brussels, near to the Royal Palace in the upper part of the city. The church was well known, and in the Grand Sablon, a well-known area of Brussels and famous for its antiques and art shops. The inside of the church could seat about 500 people, but the priest who was responsible for the church said that if they brought more chairs, then it could perhaps seat a lot more. People could also stand around the side of the church. The acoustics were excellent, and the priest was also enthusiastic about the music itself. He was also a fan of Handel's music. So the date was agreed. It would be a Saturday night, as there would be a full Christian service the following Sunday morning. Saturday night, though, suited both of them well. It was a few days later that Max and John were sitting in a cafe in the centre of Tavern. As usual, they were in their favourite local bar, where they knew both of the women who owned the bar and ran the bar. They were also drinking their favourite Belgian beers, which appeared to arrive as soon as they took the seat at a table next to the window. Max was curious Why do you always choose religious music? Why not something more modern? There are a lot of modern works that would suit a choir like yours, he asked. John looked at him slightly puzzled. I like classical church music. I love opera. So why should I choose anything else? The choir likes the music as well. Are you religious? Max asked. I've never seen you go to church or anything. So, do you believe in God and all that? John paused for a while. Are you religious? He asked. Max shook his head. No, I have never been religious in any sense. I just don't see the point of religion. I've always had problems with that word, belief. You are supposed to believe in God. What's that all about? Belief. Just because someone tells you you have to believe in God. Where is the proof? John agreed. I'm the same. The music has nothing to do with the church. It's just music. He took a drink from his beer glass. I used to be in a church choir, you know. When I was a child, I used to sing in the local church choir, so I guess that is where I got the love of the music from. But you're not religious then? Asked Max. I could be, I guess, replied John. The problem is that church doesn't want people like me, gay people. So to hell with them. If they don't want me, then I don't want them. I don't mix with people who can't take me for who I am and what I am. So, to hell with them. So that is it? Asked Mac. As simple as that? Yes, replied John, now looking serious. To hell with them. I don't care. Religions don't want people like us, so why should we waste our time with them? This was the first time that John had been so honest about himself and with Max. His outward friendliness disguised an inner hurt. There was an inner loneliness about John. His outward behavior gave everyone the impression that he was strong and confident, but Max was now seeing another side of him. He was sensitive and felt deeply. John appeared to have everything, but there was something about him that was so infinitely sad. He was a boy, lost in a world that he saw as hostile. Religion was not the reason for this. It was just that John felt rejection, and it hurt him deeply, perhaps more deeply than he was prepared to admit. For Max, he suddenly felt very protective towards his friend. He himself had always felt confident. It was a strength that he got from his parents, who, regardless of what had happened, had managed to keep their inner strength and to make it through. Max had inherited this, and John had inherited this, and Max was grateful for it. John, however, was different. He was funny, sociable, and enjoying life. But behind this facade, there was still the little boy who, for whatever reason, was struggling with his emotions. It was becoming clear that John had his demons. It was something about John that Max would come to understand later. Much later. For the time being, their house had surrendered to the plans for the Easter concert. The choir were happy with the venue, and John had successfully contacted the professional opera singers who he wanted to perform at the concert. The rehearsals were going well, and each day, each weekend, each evening, the choir turned up and sung their hearts out. Kurt and Max continued to work during the days while John immersed himself once again in his music and arranging everything he could for the concert. It was only 2 weeks away now, and he was getting nervous. Thankfully, though, for the other two, he was not as nervous as he'd been before when he knew he was going to the Royal Opera House. After that performance, A simple choir event in a church would be far more easier. It was more of what he and the rest of the choir were used to, so they were all more relaxed about the event than before. When the evening finally arrived, the three of them got into the car and headed for the church. It was easy to reach, and the rest of the choir would have no real problems. No real problems finding their way there or finding a place to park. It was just such a well-known church and so easy to find. A few days earlier, John had visited a local cafe at the far end of the Grand Sablon and asked if he could bring the church choir to their place after the concert. The cafe owner was happy to welcome them, especially since he could expect a guaranteed group of nearly 100 people squeezed into his cafe. The prospect of such an income on a late Saturday evening appealed to him. He could make sure there was enough room. He would close off an area at the back of the cafe, even if it meant turning away some of his other customers. The performance went well, and everyone was generally relaxed. All the tickets had been sold, and as the audience started to take into seats in the body of the church, Max and Kurt were beginning to wonder if they had enough seats. The priest had tried to help them and had found a collection of chairs at the back of the church, so together with some volunteers from the choir, they managed to add further room to chairs that they were already there as part of the church. There was more room now, more places for people to sit. Even so, as Max stood by the door, he was beginning to wonder if these were going to be enough. Finally, the arranged seats were full, and Max started guiding people to stand at the back of the church and around the sides. It was still filling up, and even standing room was beginning to seem full. It didn't help when people were arriving without tickets from outside the church and wanted to come in to hear the concert. However, the full church was adding to the atmosphere. Everyone was ready, and the concert began. The church was filled with the sound of the Alleluia chorus from Handel's Messiah, and it sounded magnificent at the back of the church. The priest had turned the lights on at the back of the choir, which lit up the large glazed window of the church. The setting was perfect, and the whole scene supported the performance. When it had finally finished, the audience gave an enthusiastic support. As John had predicted, it was another success for him. His ability to mix music with a venue was obvious to anyone who'd been there. It may have not been the Royal Opera House, but for an Easter concert, it had been perfect. After the concert, everyone involved headed off to the cafe at the far end of the Grand Sablon. They were in a good mood, and the cafe was filled with the chatter of all these people. The owner was as good as his word, and his staff were on hand to serve everyone with wine and beer. For once, he was doing good business for a Saturday night. He even bought out a bottle of wine and gave it as a gift to John. The choir had been happy with the whole experience, and once again John was at the center of attention. Max and Kurt could also relax and not have to worry about serving drinks. They too could have a drink and chat happily with others from the choir. Speeches were made. Thanks were given to everyone who had helped in the organization. John was the master of ceremonies and was completely in his element. It was truly another success for him, and it was something that people would be talking about for weeks to come. In the following weeks, people were still talking about the Easter concert. John was enjoying the attention. The previous concert in the Royal Opera House had seen him as a showman, standing on the stage and addressing the audience. Now they were seeing him differently, as someone who had deep understanding in music, and more importantly, how he could combine the music with a church venue. The evening had been a great success, and now they saw John, who was someone who could arrange any concert and make it a success. In Montserrat, life tried to go on as normal. John was constantly on the computer sending out emails and photos. He had now made this his first concern and appeared to have completely forgotten about his freelance work. He was doing a job that he loved now, and everything else had to take second place. For Max and Kurt, they were just happy to see John this way. Neither of them were jealous or annoyed. Kurt was immensely proud of his boyfriend, although he didn't share John's love of the music, but to see him so happy was enough. Max was also basking in his glory. John had been invited to a variety of different events and receptions, and as Kurt was not interested in these kind of things, he was happy for John and Max to go together. Most of these receptions were organized by the Brussels expat community, and as such, he wasn't really interested. He was Belgian after all, and had his own local events to go to. So Max and John spent a number of evenings attending these events in the city of Brussels. Max was expanding his social network, and thanks to John, was meeting a number of influential people around Brussels. He enjoyed these meetings and found that he got on well with the majority of other expats. He was an expat himself, and as such was part of the family. Max also attended a full operatic production at the Royal House. Thanks to John and his connection with the director, he was offered free tickets for the performance. These were not opening night tickets, but on quieter days when there were a few empty seats in the theatre. However, these empty seats were often in the expensive corporate boxes, which were the best seats in the house. Max at first felt slightly embarrassed at having a free ticket to sit in these places, but John loved it. It was something like out of a movie. People in the lower stalls were actually looking up at them as they entered their box. These were seats normally reserved for the rich and famous, and although they were not rich and famous, they were quickly becoming famous. John always entered the box first and would stand at the edge around the theatre. He would give the audience plenty of time to see him. Max was not such an exhibitionist and would hold back a bit. However, the more he got used to it, he soon found himself doing the same thing. He would stand next to John at the edge of the box and then look up and around the theatre, smiling as the other members of the audience looked up at them, wondering who they were. They would then sit down at the front of the box and consult their programs, which they also received free. "Look as though you know what you're doing," said John the first time they were in one of the boxes. "Then ignore the audience. The trick is to look as though you belong here, and this is normal for you." Max laughed. "This is surreal," he said under his breath. "I know," laughed John, "but go with it. They don't know that. Just enjoy it, but look as though you are not enjoying it. Confidence," he said, "is everything in this business." As the weather headed towards the summer, the garden at Moselstraat became more and more popular. Karen was now a regular visitor, and the three of them were also invited to her apartment in the centre of Tervuren. She was a good cook, and the evening often started with an excellent meal, followed by a few bottles of wine. They would also meet up at a local cafe for lunch, where they were becoming regulars. Other people would often drive around to the house from Brussels and other parts of Belgium. On warm summer weekends, the garden table was often used on the patio, and the barbecue was constantly in use. These were wonderful days when friends would meet and talk and eat and drink. John was always the host, and while Kurt and Max were happy to prepare the food, they also had to do the shopping. They were never short of things to eat and drink, as each visitor brought something to the party. Max and John would often jump into the car and head to the local large supermarket to get further supplies. It became a matter of principle that the fridge would never be short of beer and wine, just in case someone visited and needed a drink. The evenings were warm well into the night. It was not unusual for them to be sitting outside on the patio at midnight, still dressed in t-shirts and shorts. This was a golden time for them, when everything was perfect and Moselstraat became a mecca for anyone wanting good company and to escape the heat of the city. There was only one thing that spoiled those days at Moselstraat. Tosca was getting old, and it was clear to everyone that she was not well. While Wotan was going from strength to strength, Tosca preferred to spend her days sleeping in her basket in the lounge. It was one morning when Max was the first into the kitchen. It was a routine for the first one up in the morning to prepare the breakfast for the dogs. Max found the tins of dog food in the cupboard and after opening, started spooning the dog meat into the individual bowls. It was a normal routine. Wotan had woken up and had eased himself out of his bed in the hallway. Lazily, he walked into the kitchen and stood next to Max, looking up at him. He hadn't realized that Tosca hadn't come in to join them, as she was often the first to realize that her food was being prepared. Max didn't think anything of it and continued to prepare Wotan's large bowl of food. Taking the bowl out onto the patio, he placed it on the floor and Wotan quickly started eating. They normally put his food on the patio because he made such a mess when he was eating. On a warm day like this, he didn't mind. Sometimes on a cold day in winter, he wasn't too happy, and then he would give his bowl in the hallway. Max went back into the kitchen, but there was still no sign of her. Tosca called out, "Breakfast!" There was still no response. Concerned now, he went into the lounge to find her lying in a basket. She looked up at him, and her tongue was hanging out as she made no movement. He leant down at her and stroked her. She still didn't move. By this time, both Kurt and John had got up and were now in the kitchen. "There's something wrong with Tosca," Max called out to the other two. They both came into the lounge and stood over her. Her tail was wagging, but she still made no move to get up. "I think she's sick," said Max. I have to go to work," replied Kurt. "If she's no better this evening, I'll take her to the vet's." For the rest of the day, John took care of her, hand-feeding her and dripping water into her mouth. By the evening, there was no change. When both Kurt and Max returned that evening from the work, they found John sitting next to her, stroking her. She had not moved from her basket all day. John looked up at them with tears in his eyes. "I think she's very sick," he said, continuing to stroke her. Kurt then decided he would take her to the vet. John picked her up in his arms and carried her out into the car. Wotan could tell there was something wrong and stood at the hall doorway watching her being put into the car. Max stayed behind with him while Kurt and John moved out of the driveway and turned towards the vet's surgery. 2 hours later, they both returned, but there was no Tosca. John and Kurt walked up to the door without saying a word. John was holding a collar in his hand. Kurt shook his head sadly as they walked into the hallway. "She was very sick," he said, turning to Max and cradling Wotan's head in his arms. "The vet said that the best thing for her was that she should be put to sleep. It was the kindest thing to do." John walked into the kitchen and put a collar on the side. "Poor Tosca," he said. and started to gently cry. In the next few days, they all missed Tosca. Her basket and her collar were put away, but there was still a hole in their lives. Wotan seemed to miss her the most, and would often wander around the house sniffing the floor as if he was looking for her. The other three started making more fuss over him, and soon he was enjoying this, but not really having forgotten her. The summer weeks continued. Max found himself being close to Wotan, and they would often walk around the garden together. The weekends were more often than not filled with people who came to visit and escape the heat of the city. In those days, John received a notification that he had to submit the accounts of the choir. It was a registered charity in Belgium, or an ASBL as they called it here, and as such, for him to keep the charity status, he had to submit the records. John didn't think that this was something he had to deal with urgently. He knew that one of his choir members was a bookkeeper, an accountant, and was used to dealing with these things. John had a separate bank account for his group, so it would be easy for anyone who was used to figures to complete the return. No problem. He had also kept the bank statements so he could pass these over to someone else to do the adding up. John was the registered owner of the charity and as such was answerable to no one. He was the boss, and that was the end of the matter as far as he was concerned. Without giving it a second thought, he handed the information over to this person in the choir and then forgot about it. The sun was shining and he was beginning to enjoy life. What could go wrong?